We'll turn now to battery, which is the second major intentional tort theory directed against harms to persons. I'll lay out the learning objectives first, and then we'll go ahead and cover the material that's provided in the syllabus. First, we'll define battery. Within that definition, we'll identify the elements of proof. We'll also take a look at the policy goals behind the tort. We'll explain its relationship to assault. When we're done with that, we'll then really dig into the defining element of battery, which is harmful or offensive contact. So we'll break down the constituent ingredients to that. We'll take a look at what we mean by contact, and we'll look at some cases that help us understand it. We'll explain the tests for harmfulness. We'll go on and take a look at the concept of offensiveness and see exactly how that's determined using some of the cases provided. And we'll wrap up by determining the role that awareness plays in making out the tort. The definition of battery is a voluntary and intentional act that causes a harmful or offensive contact with another person. And when you break that down, at least the first three elements look very familiar. In fact, we're going to find that these elements repeat throughout our intentional torts. That is, there must be a voluntary act. There must be intent either to commit that particular tort or transferred intent. There must be causation, and the defining element is there must be harmful or offensive contact. Why do we protect that interest? Well, the policy is that we're trying to preserve someone's personal dignity, to keep them safe from unwanted intrusions, but we're also trying to prevent breaches of the peace that could arise when one person physically attacks somebody else. Now, assault and battery oftentimes go hand in hand. For example, if someone were to throw a rock at another person, the person might see the rock coming and might have an apprehension of an impending contact. That would be an assault. And if the rock winds up striking the victim then would be battered as well. But suppose that the rock is coming from behind the victim, and so the victim never sees it coming. There would not be an assault because there would be no apprehension, but if the rock strikes the back of the head of the victim, you would have a battery. Even when the assault and battery actually come hand in hand, that is, the person both sees the force that causes the contact and then experiences the contact, oftentimes the more significant injury is going to be caused by the contact with the battery. At least in theory, if the plaintiff could show some damage from the perception of the oncoming but unculminated act, that could be redressed with some award of damage. But typically, the plaintiff is going to complain about the injury suffered when the battery actually occurs. Now let's start breaking down the defining element of battery, first by looking at the concept of contact. It might seem pretty simple at first, but the reality is there's a little bit more nuance here than you would expect. So contact means physically touching either the plaintiff's body or things that are closely connected to the body. And that could include the clothing that the plaintiff is wearing, or maybe a hat on the plaintiff's head, or possibly something that's held in the plaintiff's hand. The reason why we extend the protection from the body itself to the things that are connected is it perfectly serves our public policy interests. We have a privacy interest in not only our bodies but the things that are closely attached. And so when someone invades that privacy space, we feel an affront to our dignity. We also might feel threatened, and that could cause a fight response. And so the law wants to prevent breaches of the peace by respecting both the body and the things attached to it. Now, we do have the Fisher versus Carousel Motor Hotel case to kind of illustrate this point. Here we had an African American gentleman who had gone to a conference, and during a break in the conference had gone to a luncheon, and while he was standing in line with a plate in his hand, an employee of the hotel comes up to him, issues a racial epithet, and then nastily grabs the plate out of his hand. And the question is whether or not he experienced a battery even though the employee didn't actually touch his body. Well, the court says he did sustain a battery because he was holding the plate and the plate was therefore connected to his body, and when it was snatched out of his hand, that was the kind of dignitary invasion that the law says is tortious. And so he did suffer a kind of humiliation from this, and the court said because that followed from the contact with his plate, that he could recover for that kind of damage. Another aspect of the contact requirement that's gotten some treatment or consideration by the courts is the notion of physicality. At common law, this was a relatively easy concept to resolve because defendants were using things like hatchets and mallets in order to inflict harm against somebody else. But in today's society, we've got more sophisticated ways in which we can harmfully contact. And the couple of cases we have here explore one of those scenarios. The scenario actually involves blowing smoke from, in this case, cigars that's inhaled by the plaintiff. In the Richardson versus Henley case, we have a woman who works in an office and her boss is blowing cigar smoke all day, every day, and as a result of inhaling it, she becomes pretty sick. She informs him of how it's affecting her, and he tries to change by going to cigarettes, but ultimately he continues blowing smoke and she continues to get more and more ill. So she winds up suing for battery, and the court actually sustains her cause of action. The court finds that cigar smoke is visible, it could be detected by the senses, it can be ingested into the body, and maybe even on top of everything else, it can have very clear physical effects. And so in this case, it was causing the plaintiff to cough and to wheeze, and for her eyes to tear up, and ultimately to bring about an allergic reaction. And so because of both the physicality within the smoke itself and because of the physical effects, the court winds up sustaining her cause of action for battery. We have a similar result in the Leichman versus WLW Jacob Communications case. Here we have a couple of DJs who are blowing cigar smoke into the face of a guest who is an anti-smoking advocate. It's very clear they were trying to maliciously antagonize him, and the court does make specific reference to the fact that their conduct really is deliberately designed in order to annoy and harass. The court also notes that cigar smoke has particulate matter in it, which could be viewed as physical, and given the extremely bad mental state of the defendants and the fact that there's at least some tangibility to the smoke, the court here also upholds the cause of action for battery by the guest against the DJs. Now, smoke's not the only thing that might be viewed as physical. Other relatively intangible things also could give rise to a battery claim. For example, sound, if it's loud enough, can create sound waves that could damage someone's eardrums. So if, for example, someone were to put a megaphone near my ear and start blasting out a message, the sound waves could be so intense that they could cause physical harm to my body. And so just like in the cigar and smoking cases, the sound here, because of its physical effects, could give rise to a showing of contact sufficient for battery. Now that we understand the concept of contact, let's turn to the idea of offensiveness. Now, generally speaking, a contact will be viewed as offensive if it would be violative of the standards of a reasonable person. But how do you know what reasonable people will find offensive? Well, this is going to be based on the circumstances. So what I want to do is review some of the cases and pick out the key facts or circumstances that seem to have been important for the court in finding some of these contacts to be offensive. So if you think about the Richardson case, again, this is the woman in the office who was inhaling the cigar smoke of her boss. One of the things that you can pick out is the relationship between them, that there was an employer-employee relationship, and by virtue of that relationship, he had some kind of power over her. She also was especially vulnerable because she suffered an allergy to the smoke, and so in some ways she was more likely to sustain not only offense but also harm. and even the context of the incident, that this was occurring during the workplace. He was engaged what was really a kind of leisure time activity for himself, and he was jeopardizing other people who were trying to work. In the Leichman case, we can also look at some of the circumstances to see why it might have been offensive for the DJs to blow smoke directly into the face of the guest. Now, one was the fact that the plaintiff had a very known sensitivity, that he hated smoking, and he was on the show specifically because he wanted to advocate against smoking. The other flip side of this is, if you look at the nature of the defendant's act, it's clear the only reason why the DJs were blowing the smoke at all was in order to antagonize him, in order to make him feel bad, and ultimately to get under his skin. Turning to the Fisher case, remember this is the case in which the African-American gentleman had his plate snatched and a racial epithet being hurled at him at the same time. Here again, you can look at the defendant's motive, right? There was racial animus involved in this, and so that's one reason why we would say that there is clear offense attached to the taking of the plate. And the context of the incident, again, seems inappropriate. This was done in a public space in front of the colleagues of the plaintiff, and so is much more likely to be damaging to his psyche. So when you put all of these things together, you can start to see that there's a number of factors that might recur in other cases. You look at the relationship of the parties, the plaintiff and the defendant, look to see whether or not there is some special vulnerability that the plaintiff suffers, or a sensitivity. Look at the context, that is the time and place in which the conduct is taking place. Look at the nature of the defendant's act. Is it the kind of thing that people naturally would be offended by? And look at the defendant's motive. Is the defendant really trying to do something in order to offend the plaintiff? And once you consider all of those factors, you don't have to satisfy all of them, but if enough of those factors are satisfied, it looks like the court will most likely find an offense, and if it's accompanied with a contact, you now have sufficient grounds for a battery. Unlike the concept of offensiveness, the concept of harmfulness is a lot more clear-cut. A harm certainly includes painful contacts to the body, and it certainly also includes any contact that would cause physiological change to the outside of the body, like a bruise which causes some broken blood vessels or perhaps broken bones. But it also might include injuries that are internal to the body, that might be caused, for example, when someone is given a poison and the poison winds up causing damage to the internal organs. Now, contact can even be harmful if it has some kind of physical benefit to the plaintiff. For example, if a surgeon were to operate without consent on a portion of the plaintiff's body, even if the surgeon fixes the part that he's operating on, the lack of consent would make that a harmful contact because the surgical cutting is a physiological change to the body. Finally, let's consider the concept of awareness. You might say that if someone were contacting your body and you're not aware of it, that it's no harm, no foul. But the reality is there is a foul, and the courts have said that a battery can be completed even if the plaintiff is not aware of the touching or the contact at the time that it's occurring. The idea here is that it's a dignitary violation for someone to touch your body without your consent, whether or not you're aware of the touching. So at the end of the day, a battery protects that dignitary interest by allowing you to bring a cause of action even if you weren't quite aware of the fact that you were being battered at the time.